Hello, my name is Heather Holt, and I am going to go over my web application that's called the Parts application. And this project is built using Python, Flask for routing, MySQL database, and Bootstrap to provide a nice interface for people to use to manage a supplier parts and shipment database. So the main goal was to be able to show database interactions, SQL operations, providing user input, making sure that there are no injection chances, all within a user interface that made that simple. So the first thing to know is that in a previous homework, we had already had the create and load database files. So that made it a lot easier to create the database in the app.py program. So what I did first was I needed to import, so we have Flask, we have requests, and we have the MySQL connector. Then we start by connecting the database. Now whenever you run this program, you would want to change it to your local database information, password, and everything. And I went to using Cursor to be able to manipulate the database. I found that to be the easiest system to use. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we're creating the database. Then we are loading the database. Once we have the database created, we can go into loading the specific amounts and making sure to commit those changes to the database. I also wanted to put messages in there to let the user know when the connection to the database was successful and if there was an error, why it failed. And here we go into actually inserting the shipment. So one of the assignment requirements was inserting specific values into the database. And this function right here is how we do that. We also have errors if there are problems when entering the information into the database, or a success error if it does go through. We also wanted to be able to increase the status of the supplier by 10%. So this was just a simple function to multiply by 1.1% to get that 10% increase for each time. It can be run multiple times if you wish. And then of course this also has our error messages and our success messages. Another requirement was displaying the information of the suppliers. So here we can see that the supplier information is easily requested, and also you get errors if there is any kind of problem pulling that information. Now here was a kind of tricky part, something that you wanted to pay specific attention to, making sure that you didn't have a vulnerability issue. So we wanted to be able to look up suppliers by the actual part number itself. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that when the user is entering any information that they're not able to do a SQL injection. So this way we don't have any vulnerabilities that we have to worry about. And also we do get success and error messages here as well. And what I wanted to do with the reset function was every time that I was testing it, I was really tired of having to run the clear database SQL file. So I just decided, you know what, I'm going to put a button in there that will erase and reseed the entire database, and that way it's easier to test. So after that, I set up the routing for viewing the database. I'm just still using Cursor to execute and pull that information. I also wanted to play around with Bootstrap. Usually I use just some old school HTML with CSS, but I did want to have an excuse to try Bootstrap, so I did implement that into this application as well to clearly show the database information and any changes that were made in a simple user interface. So here are just the remaining routes that we have. Our home page, our suppliers, our increased stats, suppliers by parts, making sure that whenever we do put in information that it's being put in cleanly. And this down here is just some multiple attempts that I was making at how to get the information to be put in correctly. So since we had specific values that we had to use for the insert shipment, I just made it 2 separate buttons. Instead of having to have someone type into individual boxes to put the information in, I simply made it buttons that'll insert it for you, and then there's also the button that will show the entire database so you can see that it has been entered. You get an error message if it has not, and a success message if it has. This is just some basic HTML for the display of the page itself, which I will show you here. Simple amount of CSS just for some pretty colors. So what we want to do, and I do have a README that has the steps of what to do here. So you want to make sure again to put in your password, your local database password. And when we run, if I can spell, if we run this and we're pulling it up locally, here I'll show you fresh of what it does. So first, if we want to look at the database as it currently stands, here we can see that everything that we put into it when we built it initially is there. So whether or not you have this database already running on your system, this will create it for you regardless. The first thing that we want to do is we want to insert this shipment information into that database. This is done using just that cursor function. And here we see that the information has been successfully entered. So if we look S2P3200, if we view the database, S2P3200 is showing there, and we did get our success message. Now here for the shipment 2, we're actually going to get an error that tells you that it is already in the system, so it will not duplicate it. Now if we want to increase supplier status by 10%, we do get a success message here. We can look at the database. We see that it has been increased by 10%, and we can actually do that again. Success message, and then we see that again it has been increased by 10% for each of the supplier statuses. Showing all suppliers gives us just the database that shows supplier information. And then we have a search by supplier part. So if we want to search by P1, we see all of the suppliers that ship P1. If we wanted to do, let's say, P4, here we get part P4 and the supplier information. If we wanted to try to break it per se, so let's say we put in Y4, which is not a part that exists, we will get an error message because that part does not exist in that database. And then again, we can start over, which reseeds the entire database back to quote-unquote factory settings. And then we can see here, just looking at the stats alone, we can tell that it was reset. And the inserted shipment that we did, the very first button, is no longer there. And we can add that again if we want to. We get our success message, and we can see it here. So that is my parts application. Have a good day.